Support for this episode of I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere is made possible by the Wessex Press, the premier publisher of books about Sherlock Holmes and his world. Find them online at wessexpress.com.
I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, episode 191, Sherlockian Musings.
I hear of Sherlock everywhere since you became a chronicler.
In a world where it's always 1895, comes I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, a podcast for devotees of Mr. Sherlock Holmes, the world's first unofficial consulting detective.
I've heard of you before. You're Holmes the meddler, Holmes the busybody, Holmes the Scotland Yard Jack in office.
The game's afoot as we discuss goings-on in the world of Sherlock Holmes enthusiasts, the Baker Street irregulars, and popular culture related to the great detective.
As we go to press, sensational developments have been reported.
So join your hosts, Scott Monty and Burt Wolder, as they talk about what's new in the world of Sherlock Holmes.
You couldn't have come at a better time!
And here it is. Welcome once again to I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, the first podcast for Sherlock Holmes devotees where it's always 1895. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm still Burt Wolder.
And we are here to muse with you about goings-on in the Sherlockian world and specifically about a very special author that has come our way by way of the west coast of Canada. And we'll get to that in just a moment. Burt, how are you holding up in these times of COVID-19, of coronavirus, of quarantine? How are you doing?
You know, I heard something about that. How's that going, that virus stuff? I'm fine. I've got plenty to read. And thank goodness everybody I know is healthy. Thank God. And I'm fine. You know, the anxiety level is down to the point where it's just 20 or 30 minutes of screeching every morning. And then I crawl out from under the bed and get back to work.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you know, I shared an image of one of the sets of books on my bookshelf I think it was on Instagram earlier this week. And I had done a thread, I think on Friday night maybe, on our Twitter account about some of my collections of the Canon. And look, there's 60 stories. They're pretty much the same in every version that you've got, whether they have pictures, whether they are in collected form, whether you have them individually. So the logical question would be, how many copies of the Sherlock Holmes stories do you actually need? It turns out quite a few. That's my answer, at least. You know, when you look at the annotated, when I look at my Oxford Sherlock Holmes set, and the picture that I sent out earlier this week was of the Folio Society set. We've got that wonderful silhouette of Holmes and Watson along the 9 volumes. And the caption that I put up there, just to kind of set the tone for, I think, where we are, is, though the world explode, these two survive, and it is always 1895. And I think that's why we do what we do. You know, we want to stand here as kind of a sense of consistency and of normalcy and of calm and serenity that we can always turn to, even in times of crisis.
Wasn't the real line that Starrett wrote there, where the mask is always N95? Isn't that what he wrote?
He should have done that. He would have been ahead of his time. He really would have.
So how many copies of the Canon do you have?
Well, to paraphrase the former Senator Phil Graham, who collected guns, when someone asked him, Senator Graham, how many guns do you own? And he said, more guns than I need, but fewer guns than I want. So I would say more copies than I need, but fewer than I want.
Well, I mean, roughly, what is it, 10, 50, 100?
Probably in the realm of 10 to 15, I would say.
Yeah, I haven't counted. I have You're right. The one, you tend to cherish things for different reasons. The John Murray books, of which I have a couple. I don't have a complete set of the Canon and the John Murray editions, but those had the great dust jackets, of course, which Nick Utekin at the Sherlock Holmes Society of London has now reprinted and published in a book, which is really great. 2 books, actually. But, the Oxford, I love Lancelin Green's annotations, yes. The Doubleday, you have to have the Doubleday. And some things, as you get into the literature of Sherlock Holmes, you find some essays that refer to pagination. So some essays are keyed to Doubleday. So if you want to look there, you want to look there. I guess I probably have, I don't think I have more than 10, but I probably have 10.
That's fair. That's fair. I remember limping along in my pre-college days with what turns out to be what was called a complete copy at the time, but it was the complete stories that were out of copyright. So it went up through, I think, The Return. Because it included The Hound of the Baskervilles and The Return. It didn't include The Valley of Fear, The Case Book, or His Last Bow. So it wasn't until I went away to university and found the Baring Gould annotated version that I discovered the rest of the Sherlock Holmes stories and how they existed and what was being said about them. And to me, that was really where the magic occurred. And I think I spent more time checking out that Baring Gould annotated edition than I did any other textbook or reference book in the library during my 4 years in college.
Yeah. I liked the Baring Gould so much I had 2 copies of it and sold one. And I think I remember 3. Some years ago you found it in an old bookshop during a BSI weekend or something. Yeah. With my Snoopy book plate still in it.
Yeah. I love that. I forgot about my my multiple Baring Gould annotators. I have 2 single volume editions and 2 double volume editions. So that estimate has simply gone through the roof now. So
well, then not that you know anything about this, but if you're a collector, you want to get things that are in the slipcase, and then you want to get some things that are in the dust jacket. Yes. And then there's the Heritage Press edition that I really like, that Freddie Steele did drawings for. Some Steele drawings are in there, and those are in slipcases. And then Murray organized them differently. There are the long stories and the short stories. That's right. You can have a happy, crazy time just buying copies of the annotated. Yeah,
I've got the omnibus short stories and the omnibus long stories, and then I've got the John Murray, Jonathan Cape individual volumes of each one. And I have the same with the Heritage Press. I have 2 copies of the 3-volume Heritage Press and 1 copy of the 8-volume Heritage Press books in their onion skin dust jackets. So that to me is like the creme de la creme of my collection. And I see Jerry Margolin is in the stream here, and Jerry is the one who recommended that I buy that off of eBay. So thank you, Jerry.
Yeah, it's really funny you should mention that. I have onion skin too, but it's just from Chris Morley's kitchen. So apparently he was making tomato sauce or something.
Shouldn't that be part of the Sherlock Holmes cookbook?
Oh yeah, that's right. Good idea. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, I suppose we've done enough patter here. We've made our guest wait long enough. Why don't we get going with the introduction?
Okay.
Sounds like a plan. Little trout in the milk for you. Well, Sheldon Goldfarb was born in Montreal long ago in another century. And yet he's always been interested in history, strange facts, reading, and writing. And he started with Black Beauty, well, unless you count Dr. Seuss and Dick and Jane, and then he graduated to sports novels and the Hardy Boys. Sheldon tells us that he's always loved a good mystery, and he eventually wrote one himself called Remember, Remember. It did get nominated for a prize. It did get nominated for a prize, but it didn't win, though. Of course, what better mysteries are there than the ones about the greatest detective, Sherlock Holmes, as we all agree. Sheldon discovered Holmes at the age of 12, and we're going to get into some specifics behind that in just a moment. And his interest in history led him to become an archivist for the Student Society at the University of British Columbia, which led in turn to his book, The 100-Year Trek, A History of Student Life at UBC. And then Sheldon acquired a PhD specializing in Victorian author William Makepeace Thackeray. There you go. He even published a couple of books about him, but they're on the scholarly side, Sheldon tells us. Better stick to his more recent output, like this one on Sherlock Holmes called Sherlockian Musings, Thoughts on the Sherlock Holmes Stories. Sheldon, welcome to I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere.
Thank you for having me.
Excellent. Well, we're actively trying to push all kinds of levers and buttons here, so we appreciate your patience with us and forgive us for any pregnant pauses that we may have here. So, you look like a natural. Have you done this before?
I've been on the Watsonian podcast, if that counts.
I would say it does. Does. So you're an old hand. So why don't we start where we begin with all of our interview guests and ask you where you first met Sherlock Holmes?
Well, as you reported in the intro, I was 12 years old. I think that's the legal age to start reading Sherlock Holmes. Anyway, I was 12 years old, and a relative of a relative gave me this collection, 4 stories. The first one was A Study in Scarlet, and I read that, and I began reading that, and it was gripping. I think a step up from the Hardy Boys, which I had read, the years before. And then I got to part 2 and was very puzzled because we were in London with Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson and trying to figure out, what does rash mean, R-A-C-H-E, and then suddenly we were in Utah. So my 12-year-old self thought, the printer must have accidentally bound 2 separate books together because these 2 things do not belong together. But and some people talk nowadays about, well, what is the connection? I mean, it's a very strange original story to start with London and Holmes and then jump to Utah and the Mormons. So, but I finished that, and then I read the next book. The next story in the book was The Sign of the Four, which at the time was one of the most terrifying things I had ever read, especially the looking through the keyhole at the distorted, twisted face of Bartholomew Sholto. And I thought, oh my God, this is horrifying. I liked mysteries at the time, but I didn't like horror. I still don't like horror. And I thought, oh, this is very scary. I've read it again since, more recently, especially to write this book, and have been less scared, although it is a scary moment. And it's a strange moment because it causes Watson to look to his side and see if Thaddeus Sholto is still there, because the figure he can see, the face he can see through the keyhole is identical, it seems, with Thaddeus, and yet all twisted and distorted. And that led me... I'm jumping a bit here, but in the book, I have some fun in the book. It's I have an academic background, and I think I draw on academic knowledge, but I try to be lighthearted. And I have a theory about the double, the Thaddeus Bartholomew double, which came to me after I read about how this story came to be, and the dinner party that the managing editor of Lippincott's had with Conan Doyle and with, of all people, Oscar Wilde, and to get them to each produce a story for Lippincott's in 1890. And so Doyle produced The Sign of the Four, and Wilde produced The Picture of Dorian Gray, which is about, a strange double up at the top of the house, and there's this nice-looking gentleman who goes out around the world, Dorian Gray, but in the attic, or wherever it is, there's a picture of him which is identical, except it's become all twisted and mangled and distorted. And I thought, wait a minute, that's like Bartholomew Sholto and Thaddeus Sholto. And so I wondered in the book, did Conan Doyle and Oscar Wilde collaborate, or did did Stoddart, the managing director, the managing editor, say to them, okay, gentlemen, I'd like you each to write a story, and how about if you each do it with some strange, distorted, mangled double? And they both went off and wrote their stories. So there you go.
I love that. I never thought to make that connection for. I mean, we certainly know about that famous dinner, no question. But the fact that you actually pieced those together and thought about the distortion of the features, that's really something. And I mean, who knows? I mean, if Conan Doyle had had his way, maybe it would have been the man with the twisted face. You never know.
Not too many people know that the reason for that twisted expression goes back, as you point out, to the publisher at Lippincotts, and that was his reaction when he got the check for that dinner.
I like that.
Right.
I like that. So, Sheldon, tell us a little bit about how you went from just being fascinated with the stories to understanding that there was kind of a movement behind them, whether it's the societies or scholarship or however you discover them in whichever order.
Well, I didn't discover them at first. I mean, after my first discovery of Holmes when I was 12, I would read occasional Sherlock Holmes collections. They were interesting stories. I enjoyed them. I went on to do a PhD in literature, but in the academic world at the time, you didn't study Sherlock Holmes. Those were detective stories. You studied Shakespeare. You studied Dickens. I studied William Makepeace Thackeray, who has an interesting connection to Conan Doyle, by the way. You may know this, because Conan Doyle's uncle, Richard Doyle, was a well-known illustrator, and he illustrated some of Thackeray's novels. And there was a gathering, a meeting. I guess the families knew each other, the Doyles and Conan Doyle and his family and Thackeray's family, because of the illustration connection. And there's a story that when he was 4 years old, Conan Doyle ended up perched on the knee of William Makepeace Thackeray. So there's your connection, the Thackeray-Doyle connection.
I had no idea. That's fascinating. That's the first time I've heard that.
And well, there you go. I found that out in some of the biographies of Doyle. I don't think it's mentioned in the Thackeray biographies, but there you go. And it's interesting because at least one story that one of the Sherlock Holmes stories borrows the plot from a Thackeray story. You just were talking about the man with the twisted lip, and that's the one, because there's a Thackeray story about somebody who seems like a gentleman and has money and deports himself like a gentleman and has nice lodgings. But it turns out he's making his money by sweeping the streets. He's a crossing sweeper. And this is shocking and all. And this is a bit similar to the man with a twisted lip, where it turns out that Neville St. Clair is not really a journalist or making money in some respectable profession, but he's a beggar. And so that story by Doyle owes something of its plot to Thackeray, although Doyle gives it a slightly different twist. The themes are a bit different. And themes are what I'm interested in the Musings book. I look at the stories. I do think of them as stories. I know some people don't, but I look at them as stories. And because of my literary background, I'm looking at the themes. And so, for instance, the Thackeray story was mainly, the theme there was, you shouldn't judge a man by how he makes his money. It's how he behaves that matters. That's what makes a gentleman. And in fact, that was a big issue in Victorian England. Dickens talks about it too. Pip, in Great Expectations, wants to be a gentleman, and that the lesson seems to be it's how you act that matters. That's sort of in the background in the Conan Doyle story, but not the main thing. The main thing seems to be that how much more fun it would be to be a beggar like Hugh Boone, engaging in witty repartee with the people who go by, the passers-by who maybe give you some money. That's much more fun than being a journalist, and it's even more lucrative. And wouldn't it be fun to get away from the everyday world and go off and do something unusual, like be a beggar or be a detective? So, which is, I think, throughout the canon, there's this pull in the direction of being a detective. Watson has an official life and wife, a wife and a life. He's a doctor with a wife, domesticity. But what he really loves to do is to head off with Sherlock Holmes and solve a case, or watch Sherlock solve the case. So there's this pull, and I think Hugh Boone is an example of it too.
Yeah. Well, I think that is interesting and astute, and you're certainly right about Thackeray. In the case book, I think it was in the case book, Conan Doyle wrote a benediction or a farewell or a preface to Holmes. And he wrote, "One likes to think that there is some fantastic limbo for children of the imagination, some strange, impossible place where the bows of Fielding may still make love to the bells of Richardson, where Scott's heroes still may strut, Dickens' delightful cockneys still raise a laugh, and Thackeray's worldlings continue to carry on their reprehensible careers. Perhaps in such a humble corner of such a Valhalla, Sherlock and his Watson may for a time find a place, while some more astute sleuth with some even less astute comrade may fill the stage which they have vacated." Okay. And then he used to lecture on English literature, so I'm sure he lectured on Thackeray.
Well, he knew his Thackeray, yes.
Yeah.
He even knew a little bit of Jane Austen, although not too much. I was reading that he only came to read Jane Austen once when he was sick, but he was ill and he had nothing else to do, so he read Pride and Prejudice. And I found this out because I gave a little talk to the Jane Austen Society here in Vancouver to discuss any connections between Conan Doyle and Jane Austen. So there you
go. Those Janeites can be rabid. They are big fans. I know we have a regular Janeite listener here, Mary Miller. She pops in from time to time and loves to make the Austen, Doyle, or Holmes connections. So, Sheldon, tell us a little bit about how the concept for this book, Sherlockian Musings, how this came about, because you provide a good background in the introduction here, and it involves both scholarship and your interaction with the society. I'd love our listeners and viewers to be able to hear a little bit more about that.
Okay, well, I'm a member of the Stormy Petrels of British Columbia, the Sherlock Holmes Society in Vancouver, and I joined them back in 2003, thanks to Peter Wood, the late Peter Wood, who was what we called the Priory Schoolmaster back then, which meant, every month the Stormy Petrels get together and have a meeting. In the largest section of the meeting is a discussion of one of the stories from the canon, and Peter would organize those discussions. He would produce notes for them and study questions, and then the Petrels, as we're called, would discuss in the meeting. And he did that. He was doing that when I joined in 2003, and he did that up until his death in 2011, at which point Aurélie Martel took over as a schoolmaster, and then eventually it got passed to me. And I began to try and follow in Peter's footsteps, but I did it in my own way. And rather than study questions, which were a bit like what you would get in a school setting, I did more musings. I just thought, well, what is this about in the story? What's going on here? Could it be that such and such is happening? And so I did these once a month. I started with the stockbroker's clerk. That's when I took over. And once a month I did a musing. And eventually I collected a lot of them. And my girlfriend, Roberta, said, you should get these published. And I thought, well, but if I do that, then where would be the fun every month of doing a new one? But then back around Labor Day in 2018, the Sherlockian group in Halifax, Nova Scotia, which is known as the Spence Munros, because you may recall in the Copper Beaches, Violet Hunter's employers head off to Nova Scotia, and those employers are called they're the Spence Munros. So anyway, the Sherlockian Society in Halifax is called the Spence Munros, and they said, we're doing the Red-Headed League next week, and we know about your musings. Have you done a musing on the Red-Headed League? Which I had not yet, because I started with Stockbroker's Clerk and was going around in the cycle, but I dashed one off on Labor Day weekend and sent it to them. And their president, Mark Alberstadt, also the editor of Canadian Holmes, the Canadian Journal of Sherlockian Studies, said this should be a book. And so people were telling me this should be a book. So I got in touch with the publisher and Steve Emmets, and he was interested. And so I had done about 35 of the stories. So I had to quickly do the last 25, and which I did over, winter, spring, 2018-19. And now there's a book of 60 different essays, or musings as I call them, one on each of the stories in the canon. And there you have it.
That's fantastic. So tell us a little bit about what goes into a typical musing. How do you approach it? How do you decide what to muse upon?
Well, I reread the story for the group or for the book. I read the commentaries. I read, Baring Gould and Les Klinger and other Sherlockian commentators. There are also some academic commentators, not that many. In the old days, as I said, the academics look down their nose at detective stories, but starting in the 60s or 70s, there have been more academic writings on the stories. Some of those people tend to have we're going to show you how every one of the stories is like the hero's journey out of Carl Jung and Joseph Campbell. Or we're going to show you how it's all about the class conflict between the upper middle class and the aristocracy, which is true in a way, because Holmes and Watson and the stories seem to jab at the nobility and the aristocrats and the landed gentry whenever they can. But I'm a bit skeptical of these academics who have one theory that explains all. It's like saying Moriarty explains all the crime in London, which to me was an odd notion when it was, when you come across it in the canon, thinking, wait, there's a stolen racehorse. He didn't steal the racehorse, Anyway, so I read the academics. I get ideas from them. I try not to use their sort of language because academic language is a bit, impenetrable sometimes. And then I think about what they've said. I think about what I came up with from reading the story myself. And then I just start, like with Silver Blaze, I was wondering, why does Sherlock Holmes bring, we have field glasses in this story. So what does that mean the story is about? Because mostly, in the stories, he's carrying a magnifying glass, a lens. So I find something that strikes my fancy, and so I began my musing on Silver Blaze by saying, well, we start with a pair of binoculars, and why is that? Because usually he's with a magnifying glass, he's lying down on the ground, prone to look through his lens, but this time it's a field glass or binoculars. And why do you bring binoculars to a horse race? Well, it's obvious, to see the race. And what does that tell you about what the story is about? Well, the story is about a horse race, which I know might seem too obvious even to say. But then I start wondering, but why? Doyle was no expert in horse racing. In fact, he had to apologize for making some errors, although sometimes he didn't apologize. He said, people complain about details, but the question is, who is to be master? That's all. And I don't care about the details. So why did he care? Why did he want to do a story about a horse race? And I was thinking, well, what is a horse race? A horse race is a competition. And so in a way, the theme of this story, which is different, not that common in Doyle, I think the theme of this story is what motivates men, especially men. The men are putting the horses forward to run in the race, and it's competition. Although Sherlock Holmes has to be on the scene to make sure the competition is fair. So you can't go stealing the favorite. Sherlock Holmes will find it and bring him back. But it's all about how society is really a society of competition, and that's what comes across in this story, and that's where I went to musing with this story. And then one thing leads to another. I muse on in the same musing, I talk about competition, the game's the thing, and at the end, I talk about imagination, which Holmes often resorts to the imagination, even though he's sort of a rationalist. And yet he's a great believer in the imagination, and sitting on the picture on the front of the book is him musing, as if you like, while smoking one of his many pipes, and doing it like he's on an Eastern divan. So there's something Eastern and mystical mixed in with his rationality, which I find in a lot of the stories that there's a lot of doubleness. Is Holmes or is Doyle, are we talking, people from foreign lands? Are they helpful or are they the villains? It varies from story to story, and it's hard to say Doyle is just talking about this or the stories are just talking about this. They raise important issues like reputation, but they don't always take the same point of view on such things. So it's interesting. And I ended the Silver Blaze one by talking about how it's a favorite pastime of Sherlockians to point out the failings of Sherlock Holmes. For instance, I think in Klinger, there's he couldn't possibly figure out the speed of the train from counting the milestones. And then people argue about that. And what puzzles me about that is these are all big fans of Sherlock Holmes, but one of their games they like to play is say, well, he was wrong then. He couldn't have done that. The train couldn't have left at that point. The schedules we've looked up tell us that's impossible. And and this is my question for you, why this attempt to catch Holmes out so much? And I don't know. So
that's interesting. So you've got suppositions. You're making you're making some educated guesses. You're making some observations as to what goes on there. You are, in some ways, posing more questions, more musings, giving people something to think about and to unravel on their own time and to come up with their interpretation. Would that be an accurate estimation of how you've structured the book here?
Yes, although I would say I never guess. It's a shocking habit. But yes, I'm musing. I'm throwing out ideas. I mean, sometimes I think this might be true, but I leave it open to people to say. And when we discuss these at the Petrels meeting, sometimes people say, Sheldon, sometimes a cormorant is just a cormorant. Stop trying to find all this symbolism in it, that sort of thing. So I leave it open to other people to put forward their ideas. And I'm trying to stimulate thought and discussion about the stories. Yes. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, we would like to pause here for just a moment and stimulate a little thought as we go to our sponsor.
In the ancient Anglo-Saxon kingdom of Wessex, our village elders have been wearing masks for years, but that's only because of 8th century dental hygiene. You are lucky to be trapped at home because now you have time to read Sherlock Holmes and Conan Doyle in the newspapers. Volume 5, edited by Matthias Bostrom, Mark Alberstadt, and Leah Gwynn. With a wealth of Sherlockian treasures unlocked at last from old and accessible newspapers, reporting the doings of Arthur Conan Doyle and Sherlock Holmes as they first appeared to the world. Read about the great success of Conan Doyle's play A Story of Waterloo, with the script of the one-act play included. And it's available right now at our wessexpress.com. Friends, social distancing is important, but there's plenty of room to reach for the pleasure only a volume from the Wessex Press can provide. Choose yours today.
And we're back. We are back for more with Sheldon Goldfarb from British Columbia, coming to us from the coast. We've got live watchers, live viewers, and listeners from all over the world. We've got folks also from Canada, all the way in Nova Scotia. Mark Alberstadt himself, who was mentioned earlier by Sheldon, is here. We've got our friend Badre Alamir Bali from Egypt. That's fantastic. I think that's one of our first identified fans from Egypt. And we've got folks from all over the continent. Thank you for being here. Thank you for participating in this very special episode of I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere. So, Sheldon, we're talking about your inspiration, your muses here. To me, as Bert and I, we go through the canon a lot of different ways. We have another podcast you may have heard of called Trifles that comes out every week, and it's something that we take 15 to 20 minutes every week to talk about some aspect of the canon. So a couple of things. One, I think your book, Sherlockian Musings, actually provides us with so much more fodder. I was worried we were going to run out of material later this year when we finally reach episode 221. I'm thrilled to say we've got much more to work with thanks to your musings here. But it seemed to me as I was reading it to be almost inspired by some of the old Sherlockian scholarship. I think about Martin Dakin's Sherlock Holmes Commentary or the Hardwicke's Sherlock Holmes Companion. Can you talk a little bit about maybe some of the Sherlockian scholarship that you've come across over the years and how that may or may not have inspired you?
All right. Well, I haven't actually read the Martin Dakin. I went through the annotations of Baring Gould, and it always was a struggle to find the story in Baring Gould because he puts them in this chronological order according to his theories of when the cases took place. And I'm looking for, I know this is in volume 2 of the Doubleday. Where is it in Baring Gould? That sort of thing. But I would eventually track down the stories in Baring Gould and read his commentary. Baring Gould and Les Klinger and that sort of traditional Sherlockian scholarship go in a slightly different direction. They talk about, I noticed my friend Bob Coghill wrote as a comment here that they are accounts, Sheldon. They are accounts. They're true accounts. They're not stories. And I'm coming from the literature side and treating them as stories. I think they're very good stories. They're very artistic. And I've discovered this more in writing the book and in doing the musings. When I was growing up, they were just detective stories, which were fun. And I didn't think to study them either when I did my PhD in English literature. I studied Shakespeare and Dickens and Thackeray. So that's where I come from. And so it's an interesting, the people who play the game do the very thing I was trained never to do as an academic, which is there's a famous article called How Many Children Has Lady Macbeth, which is meant to be a criticism of people who go outside the Shakespeare play and try to examine questions that aren't raised in the play, like how many children does Lady Macbeth have? And so I know a lot of traditional Sherlockian scholarship is going to say, well, where did Holmes go to school? What professions did he practice beforehand? Was he a musicologist, a music critic, that sort of thing? And what's Watson's ancestry, that sort of thing? I restrict myself to what's in the stories, and I try to figure out what the stories suggest and what they suggest thematically, like I was talking about with The Man with the Twisted Lip and the joy of escaping from professional life and going off and being a beggar or being a detective. And that's a theme in the stories, the clash between that and, say, the domesticity that almost seems to swallow things up at the end of The Sign of the Four when Watson marries Mary Morstan and says, well, that's it for my adventures. I've had enough of Sherlock Holmes. I'm going to go home and live with Mary. And you're thinking, but then that doesn't happen. But that's a constant. Mary remains in the stories for a little while over the next little bit, the early stories and the adventures. And although, as I note, sometimes I'd like to explore the significance of some of the similes. Like there's the story that begins, I think it is The Man with the Twisted Lip, by saying Mary was this wonderful woman and people would come to her with their problems. They would flock to her like birds to a lighthouse. And I thought, well, that sounds nice. But then I thought, let me look up this notion of birds flocking to lighthouses. And when I did, I discovered that, yes, birds are attracted to lighthouses. They fly at lighthouses. They collide with the lighthouses and they die. They kill themselves. And so I thought, this is the simile that comes to Watson's mind or Doyle's mind in talking about his wife. And this is right before he comments that he's yawning while talking with her after dinner. And then it seems like quite a joy when Sherlock Holmes shows up and says, there's a case. Or actually, I guess it's not Sherlock Holmes. There's a case does show up then. He has to go after it's the friend who comes up and her husband is in the opium den, and Watson has to go off and solve that case like he's going to be the hero. So I follow that. I follow a bit of Joseph Campbell and the hero's journey. Sometimes it's true. The stories begin, A Study in Scarlet and The Sign of the Four, are very much Watson like on a journey and trying to discover what is this strange person I've come across named Sherlock Holmes. Like A Study in Scarlet begins where you find Watson is down on his luck. He's an idler and he's not well. He's suffering in the cesspool of London. And that's the perfect setting that you usually get in these heroic stories, like the person who doesn't seem to know where he's going and suddenly he's swept up in an adventure. And the adventure at first seems to be Watson's. And Watson gets to meet Sherlock Holmes. In the book, I compare him to a Marlowe in Heart of Darkness going off to try and find Mr. Kurtz. So Holmes is his Mr. Kurtz. So my inspiration there is literature itself, Conrad, or the notions of Joseph Campbell and Jung, the psychologist, things like that. So, I mean, I read Klinger and Baring Gould, and they sometimes explain some of the references. It's interesting, but they do go in a slightly different direction than I do. But I found with the Stormy Petrels, although their tendency is to go in that other direction, they're very accepting of my musings, and we talk about my musings, and then Bob will say, but Sheldon, they're really accounts, and let me tell you, whatever. So there you go.
Well, just so our listening and viewing audience knows, if you'd like to ask any questions of Sheldon while we're still in the interview here with him, we still do have a few moments left, so feel free to ask away on Facebook or on YouTube.
Oh, Howard had a question. What's Sheldon's muse on Watson's Bullpup?
We just did this story in the Petrels, and the question was whether it's a real bullpup or it's actually slang for a type of gun. It's sort of, the others in the group had more to say about this. It didn't come to me as something I would muse about in a literary way, so I'm afraid I can't enlighten you on that one.
A lot of people don't really know this, but Watson's Bullpup was a small stuffed animal that his mother had given him. And as soon as he mentioned it to Sherlock Holmes, he was terribly embarrassed, which is why you never hear about it again.
And there, ladies and gentlemen, directly from the mind of Bert Wolder. This is why academics don't speculate, I guess. Well, I've also heard the idea that to have a bullpup was to have a temper. To keep a bullpup is to have a temper. I haven't necessarily seen that expression used anywhere outside of the canon, and I haven't seen a lot of evidence for it, but I know that's another one that people tend to hang their hats on. So we've got a question from Rob Nunn. Rob asks, who's the most interesting character in the canon? What would you say to that, Sheldon?
You mean besides Holmes and Watson? I mean, they're the two most interesting. Besides that, I'm interested in Violet Hunter in the Copper Beeches and how she can play detective too. The Copper Beeches is an interesting story. To me, it was like three different stories in one. It's a detective story in which Violet Hunter can do as much detecting as Sherlock Holmes and is very resourceful using, I forget what she uses as a sort of mirror to see what's going on when she's not supposed to see what's going on. On the other hand, it's sort of a bit of a gothic horror, especially when she discovers those tresses of hair, which look exactly like her hair, in the drawer in the room that she's staying in. And the horror part of it connects less to her, though, than to the daughter of the family that she's impersonating and who is kept imprisoned up in the tower, like Rapunzel. Who has to be rescued. Like she's not an active heroine like Violet is. Violet's an active heroine and gets to have her own school at the end. Whereas I think it's Alice is the other female character, and she gets carried off by Fowler. And I thought it was amusing. Fowler gets there before Hunter. And spirits Alice away, and then she marries him. So that's the gothic part. There's also the detective part. And now I'm forgetting what the third sort of genre was that was in there. But But Violet Hunter is an interesting character in that way.
You know, I never made the connection before between fowl and hunter.
Yes, well, there you go.
All right. As you've had a chance to muse about all 60 stories, I mean, obviously you've given these a lot of thought. You've gone over them with the Stormy Petrels. And I know this is really hard for anyone to do when you've got a work like this, but Ruben asks, which story is your favorite and why?
Well, I used to say, and this is before I wrote the book, I used to say my favorite was Silver Blaze, largely because of the wonderful exchange in it, the famous exchange about, is there anything else to which you would draw my attention, to the dog in the nighttime, but the dog did nothing in the nighttime, Sherlock Holmes says to the curious incident of the dog in the nighttime, and the response is the dog did nothing in the nighttime, and Sherlock Holmes says that was the curious incident. A brilliant piece of deduction from the fact that nothing happened. And I still love that exchange, and I like that story. And when I got to that story, maybe my expectations were too high, and I thought, oh, well, it's a good story, but I wonder why I put it as number one. But in analyzing is different from evaluating. In an analyzing Silver Blaze, that's where I came up with my binoculars as opposed to magnifying glass thing. So it was very interesting to figure out that this is a story about racing, which means about competition. And so that was interesting to do. And I also found the Copper Beaches very interesting because of the texture and the depth and how Violet Hunter has to do all these things. And the way Copper Beaches is almost a contrast to some of the earlier stories in the adventures, which focus on the problems in the family. You have a couple of young women. There's the one in A Case of Identity who wants to go out and live a life and meet a man and marry, perhaps. And her stepfather will have none of it, and so pretends to be a suitor and then keeps her from meeting anyone real. And there's also in The Speckled Band, where the stepfather will go even further and will try and murder the stepdaughters who want to go out and get married. And so it's like, young people want to go, and the same thing in The Beryl Coronet, the young people want to go live their lives, and the father is keeping them sort of trapped in the family. Young people want to live their lives. And then you get to Copper Beaches, and it's like, okay, Violet Hunter is going to lead her life, and well, first she has no job. There's a problem. Will she find a job? And because she loses the job when the Spence Monroes go off to Nova Scotia. And then she does get a job, but involves all these difficult things, and she has to decide, first of all, is she going to take this job and cut her hair and sit in the chair over there and then over there and do all these strange things. And so it's like, on the one hand, some of the stories talk about young people wanting to grow up and leave the nest. And then this one talks about how when you do leave the nest, there's all sorts of problems. And I think that illustrates how the stories touch on very important themes in real life, and they don't always approach them from the same direction. Anyway, that's why Copper Beaches appealed to me.
Yeah, those are good choices. I think those are strong stories. They certainly held up well throughout the years. They were, of course, part of Conan Doyle's own list of his top 12 stories that he came up with at the end of his at the end of writing the canon. So you're in good company there, Sheldon. Looks like we have a question from our friend Badre in Egypt. He says, Mr. Goldfarb, what sources would you mostly recommend regarding Sherlockian studies? What are your go-to resources for Sherlockian scholarship and material?
So I guess he means besides my book. Well, I'm pretty eclectic. So I did discover the Joseph Kessner book on Sherlock's Men, which was interesting and gave me lots of insights into the stories. Although he has his view of how to see all the stories. All the stories are about gender relations, male-female relations. But he's an interesting one to look at. Who else? Who do I put in my bibliography? There's a couple of it's different from every story. There were a couple of interesting critics, academic critics, who talked about the creeping man. And the creeping man can be seen as, well, this horrible guy who's taking monkey glands, and isn't that terrible? And and then trying to tamper with nature. But these two critics said, well, look, but he's invigorating himself, reinvigorating himself. And he's not hurt by Sherlock Holmes says this is horrible, but do we have to agree with Holmes all the time? And so there were a couple of critics who led me to see The Creeping Man, which is a horribly misnamed story, by the way. He's not creeping at all. He's bounding about and climbing, leaping. And it led me to see The Creeping Man as a very interesting story about how to deal with growing old. Niels Clausen has a book just out about the art of fiction in Conan Doyle's stories, and he talks about, he's also approaching them from a literary point of view. There's the one about the marriage of Sherlock Holmes. Who wrote that one? It's escaping me now. Anyway, he wrote a bunch of eccentric stories about it, but, poke around and find what appeals to you.
Sheldon, what's your thinking about pastiches? Do you like some? Do you like any? Are you interested in what they do to the characters? Do you hate them?
I know the Sherlockian world is a very big world, and it includes pastiches, it includes movies, it includes TV shows, and I like the original canon the best. I like the stories the way that Conan Doyle wrote them, or John Watson wrote them, as Bob, I'm sure, will tell me. The pastiches, I like the originals best.
Yeah.
I like original ideas best. That's why I tend to call it The Sign of the Four, which was the original title, and then somebody decided to drop the second "the," and but I like to call it. I like to use both "thes," and there you go.
Yeah, why not? Doesn't cost anymore. One of the things I'm curious about, we mentioned very early on in our conversation here when Scott was introducing you, I think, that you had written a book called The History of Student Life at USB. And what immediately occurred to me was, what was the most unusual thing you discovered when you researched the history of student life? Did anybody keep a bear in the dormitory? Or?
Oh, there are all sorts of myths about people bringing cows up to the top of the clock tower, which cannot be verified. There are all sorts of interesting things, like the group of students who pretended to be something called the revolutionary Trotskyites, not Trotskyites, but Trotskyites, because they lived on a street called Trutch in Vancouver. So Trutch Street, Trotskyites. And they would put notices in the student newspaper announcing that they were going to have a Fellini meeting or a central committee meeting to discuss division of labor, which meant who was doing the chores in the house, that sort of thing. That was quite amusing. I discovered this in doing the history, and I put it in the book, but I had no idea who the revolutionary Trotskyites were until I talked about them in an interview for the alumni magazine at UBC. And that interview was published, and someone wrote in and said, "Oh, that was us. I was one of the Trotskyites." And we ended up writing an article about where they were 40 years later. They were all respectable lawyers and economists and professors.
Oh,
what a shame.
That's disappointing.
It's wonderful, Sheldon, to hear you muse on all things literary, whether it's Thackeray or student life at the University of British Columbia, or, of course, Sherlockian Musings. Everyone needs to get a copy of Sherlockian Musings, Thoughts on the Sherlock Holmes Stories. We will have a link to the book in the show notes. It's available from MX Publishing as well as from Amazon or wherever good and tasteful books are sold. What's next for you, Sheldon?
Oh, dear. Well, I seem to be doing a lot of these, interviews, talks, and so forth for about the Sherlock Holmes book. But at the moment, I'm working on an essay on Oliver Cromwell, of all things, just for the fun of it, really. I took a course just for the fun of it on Babylonian mythology. I explore where things take me and whatever catches my fancy. So there you go.
That's amazing. Well, I'm delighted to hear it. And we're pleased to have such a polyglot as yourself on the show with us here. We wish you all the best in British Columbia with the Stormy Petrels. Say hi to Bob for us, and thanks again for being on I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere.
Thank you.
Well done, Bert.
Oh, well done. It was great to talk to Sheldon. What were the unreconstructed Trotskyites? I like that a lot. That's good.
I want to see if somebody can actually recreate bringing the cow to the top of the tower there. That would be something.
Oh, well. Depends on how far back you go, you know. I mean,
I know.
People got up to some pretty crazy things in the end of the 19th century.
There wasn't the internet back then to entertain people. There wasn't I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere to keep them
impossible.
occupied. See, we're keeping cows out of bell towers all around the world.
That's right.
It's a public service we do here.
That's right.
That's fantastic. Well, I am, when I mentioned Sheldon's book being fodder for us for Trifles, I wasn't kidding. I mean, there's lots of great questions and, as we say, musings that he puts forward in the book here, angles that I haven't considered before, and some things that are familiar as well. But I think it brings it all full circle, and I think it'll be fantastic for us to have an opportunity to explore that in greater detail. That's right, it's time for Canonical Couplets, everyone's favorite Sherlockian quiz show, where we give you a couple of lines of poetry that are supposed to represent one of the stories, and you are supposed to give us the proper answer. The last time around, we gave you this canonical couplet. The killer nearly escaped if it weren't for a hook. The clue was buried in a half-remembered book. Bert, do you know which Sherlock Holmes story we were referring to there?
Oh, yes. That was the famous case of the failed haberdasher who experimented with new articles of clothing. That was the cardboard socks.
Not enough Tylenol in the world. No, Bert, it was a good guess. Actually, it was a horrible guess. But you were wrong as usual.
Again.
Yeah.
Wrong again.
In this case, it was, what we were looking for was the lion's mane.
Oh,
yes,
that was my second guess.
Yeah. Well, fooled a lot of people, too. We didn't have quite as many entries that time around. I'm thinking maybe listenership is down because people aren't commuting as much anymore, being shut in. Whatever it is, we're here and back for more quizzing and prizing. We do have a winner set up. We need to figure out exactly who that is as we get the big spinning prize wheel out here. It's off camera, but I will give it a big spin right now. Watch it go around and slow down. And it looks like it's landing on number 13. Now, that's not supposed to be lucky normally, but in this case, we think it's extremely lucky because the winner, as it corresponds with number 13, is David Rosenbaum. Our in-studio audience loves that, David. Now, what did David win if he chooses? I know David is overseas in Israel and has won before and has graciously turned down the prize because shipping is a bear, but David won this copy of The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, the leather-bound Barnes & Noble edition, with a lovely satin bookmarker. So that was this time around. Congratulations, David. And now, of course, for those of you that want to play along this time, we're going to give you this canonical couplet. Holmes was fighting for a client, brave and earnest, while facing a foe who was most pathetic and sternest. If you think you know the answer to this canonical couplet, jot it down in an email addressed to comment@ihearofsherlock.com with canonical couplet in the subject line. If you are among all of the correct answers and we choose your name at random, you win a prize.
the couplets are really nice. They're nicely written.
Well, we're running out of them. We're nearly at our. I think this is our 56th couplet that we've done. Our 56th episode with a couplet. There are only 60 couplets, as you know. So we're going to have to go back and probably put together all new couplets for the following 60 shows. Should we be that long in the tooth? We'll see. I did want to mention that the prize this time around is. Why, it's a copy of Sherlockian Musings. How strange.
Oh, good God.
We will get a copy of Sheldon's book to you if you are the lucky winner. All right. Well, Bert, it's been a pleasure musing with you here once again. I think we'll look forward to doing this again in 2 weeks when we'll have, I think we'll keep it a surprise, but we've got another exciting book to talk about, the editor/author of which will be joining us.
Fabulous. Can't wait.
Excellent. Well, I am the always amusing Scott Monty.
And I'm the perpetually consistent Burt Wolder.
And together we say,
The game's afoot.
The game's afoot.
I'm afraid that in the pleasure of this conversation, I am neglecting business of importance, which awaits me elsewhere.
Thank you for listening. Please be sure to join us again for the next episode of I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, the first podcast dedicated to Sherlock Holmes.
Goodbye, and good luck. And believe me to be, my dear fellow, very sincerely yours, Sherlock Holmes.
Rob has an interesting suggestion here. Rob says, I would love to listen to an episode of iHose where Scott and Bert interview each other's wives about living with a Sherlockian.
Yeah, that'd be a lot of fun.
Nah, not for us.
Hold on, let me write that down.
Rob, it might be...
no pencil.
Rob, it might be fun for you, but not for us. And we got to draw the line somewhere.
Actually, it would be a lot of fun for me because I wouldn't even need to appear. I mean, you would just ask Kathy a question and I can come back in an hour. In our house, we've got so much clutter that while we've been huddled away for the coronavirus, my wife has been engaged in dealing with things that should be disposed of. And so she said the other day, we need to make an inventory and collect all the things around the house that we don't use. And, the next thing I knew, she was carrying me out to the recycling.
So